Welcome to the Two Marketing Moms podcast.
Women with 50 years plus of marketing
Integrity
experience.
and culture are extremely important.
You can still say, I don't know.
Stop multitasking and be present in the
Moms
moment.
have balls, big time.
Welcome to the Two Marketing Moms podcast. We are two women with more than 50 years of marketing and advertising experience between us, and we want to talk about the struggles, the fails, and the wins that we experienced while building our careers, being a boss, juggling work and a home life, and arguably the hardest and yet most fulfilling job, being a mom. This podcast was created for marketing and advertising professionals, especially the up-and-coming marketing stars of the future. We hope these tips, tricks, and advice will help you navigate work and life and get ahead. Today is a very revealing episode. Kelly, take it away.
It is a revealing episode, and we've been talking about doing this for 6 months, and it took us that long to be brave enough to actually talk about it. And so failure is a challenge to talk about and admit. And frankly, probably most people don't necessarily even admit their failures to themselves, let alone to the world through a podcast. And
putting it out there.
And, I kind of put this in the same category as our last podcast, which was the worst business advice we ever received. Because in both cases, you tend to put your failures, as well as the worst business advice you received, in the back of your head, and you don't really dwell on them, right? But today,
unless you're me, I do a lot of dwelling.
That's true. You're processing and you're writing about it, and it's a good thing. And I think it was a really great exercise for me. So today, we are going to be brave. We all make mistakes, but few talk about it. And we're going to be talking about it today. And we were both kind of inspired by this quote from the Williams-Whittle Book Club that I read, a book called The Storyteller's Secret by Carmine Gallo. And I'm going to read this quote to you really quick because it meant a lot to me. And it said, "We all have profound crises of confidence or even fail at some point in our careers. Inspiring leaders embrace their past and have the courage to share the lessons they've learned. Appreciate your roots, protect those roots, and share the stories that strengthened you." And so that's what we're going to be doing today on our episode on failure. So I think the first place that we're going to start is figure out how to encapsulate what are our failures and reveal them up front without telling our stories, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to reveal mine, and then you will reveal yours, and we'll kind of just chat about that before we go into it. Because I literally sat down, as you saw, on a piece of paper, and I wrote down my top 5 failures, and I narrowed them down to 2, as did you, because I don't want to reveal everything. This is not a reality show. But a lot of them have commonalities. And so my failures in business can be narrowed down to 2 areas that are related, and that's people and politics. And we've talked a lot about this in previous podcasts about how in marketing, we spend a lot of our time studying the target audiences that we're trying to reach, but we don't spend a lot of time studying and learning about each other. And so that's kind of the theme of today. So what are your 2 failures in terms of themes and topics?
Yeah, so I started with writing down my actual failures and then realized, well, let's zoom out of those specific things and figure out what was the real failure, right? Like the situation was just the situation. So I boil mine down to poor decision-making, or maybe not being able to make a decision. And then also misalignment. When one person or one organization is not aligned with your thinking, and you either know it and ignore it, or you have no idea.
Would that be more culture fit?
It could be a lot of different things. In my case, my example is much more about just the failures that I made in my trying to set up a new client relationship and expectations from my end and maybe just a different vision than the client had. And it turned out to be a failure. And it haunts me still.
We're going to work on that today, Julia, because it should no
Yes.
longer haunt you. Once you get these things out, we're going to release them. We'll find some doves and tie little messages and let them float, float out to
I know
the
it's
air.
going to be so therapeutic.
Or we'll
I
burn
mean,
them.
yes, let's do. The reason why I liked this episode because it was your idea, Kelly.
Okay.
I'm gonna give you credit for it. I was open to talking about it because I do think that talking about your failures, like the quote says, like when you're vulnerable is usually when you can grow the most. You know, I recently was talking to a business coach just like 2 weeks ago, and I just sent him an email and said, I need to talk about a couple things because I just really need to get vulnerable. Like, I need to say the things that I would never tell anyone in the world. And he was like, yeah, vulnerability equals growing. So I think we will grow, and then hopefully people listening will be able to kind of categorize their own failures, like acknowledge them, and then what we're going to do, let them float away.
Exactly. But we're going to learn from them too,
Yes.
right? And I
So
think
many lessons.
there's a saying that I actually looked to see if it was attributed to someone, and it's not. And it's that people grow more from their failures than they do from their successes. And
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true, because that's when you kind of are slapped in the head with, an error, something that you needed to fix, or you need to fix, or you'll keep making that same mistake. And I'll make a similar analogy to like dating in your 20s, when you continually date the same type of guy that shows up at your house at 3 a.m. continually, and you're like, not going to work for me. But
Yeah.
that's another
Agreed.
podcast.
Agreed. Like both of my big failures that I do tend to dwell on, like for sure had huge breakthroughs with
All
them.
right. All right. So to prep for this episode, I talked to my dad. My dad is one of my biggest mentors, and he always has wonderful pieces of advice and wisdom. And he's turning 80 this year, so it's fun to get this stuff down on paper and to hear his stories and about his failures and his successes. So I always interview for him for some ideas before a podcast. So just to give you a little background, my dad was an international businessman. He started one of the first cell phone companies back in 1983 in Seattle. I was actually the only kid in school that had a cell phone in my car.
Like a Zach Morris phone
Like
in your car.
literally a cell phone with a cord that's attached to the car.
That's so great.
And it was good and bad, because then my mother would call me at like 5 minutes to 12 with 5 kids in the back of the car saying, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'm coming." So good and bad. Anyway, his specialization was in bringing together cellular and cable, and he packaged it together as broadband technology internationally. And so he worked in Russia and Poland and the Czech Republic and Spain, France, and he had many challenges, and a lot of them had to do with communication and language and explaining the complexity of the technology that he was trying to build, so that people would understand it. And he had some really great wins, and he had a couple of big fails in different countries around the world. And so when I told him that my failures were all related to people and politics, he said the following: people is politics, because all people are political. You are either for management in a company or you're against it. Politics is about power from the center being distributed out. And what he means is you really have to understand where the power lies. If you don't understand where the power lies, you can't manage politics. And he said that 90% of the time, your key problems are people problems, because problem solving requires cooperation, and it's about finding common ground slowly and gradually, and involves differing opinions and points of views. And his philosophy was that you really need to recruit people that are going to help you kind of narrow that difference, and recruit people who are experts in their area, because especially if it involves technology, there's a big learning curve. And he felt like his failure often came because he didn't recruit the right people or grasp the right ideas or technology, and getting people aligned in those areas is always the biggest problem. And for me, that was a big epiphany, that literally everything associated with people boils down to politics, and people is politics. And I hadn't thought about it in that way. What are your thoughts on what his philosophy is?
I mean, I think it's right on. I completely agree. If you can't get along with people, if you can't build favor with people, if you can't communicate with people, and we've talked about this on other episodes, really understanding, where the other person is coming from, what their personality traits are, how they will respond to you, being who you are. If you can't do that, then, you're living on an island of one. You can't expect to, have great relationships. You can't expect to have great successes if you cannot figure out how to get along with people. And that is people in politics. I saw this, I was tagged on this really long LinkedIn thread recently. And actually it was someone had asked, what's the worst business advice you had ever received?
Oh, and you're
Of
all over
course,
it.
yeah, I was so jazzed that one of my colleagues had asked this. And of course I read every comment. And he also asked, like, what's the one thing you wish you had known when you were younger? And someone wrote this: politics matters. In fact, it's all that matters. Results are secondary. Doing a great job is secondary to whether the boss likes you.
Mm.
And I mean, maybe that's not 100% true, but it is people in politics. And exactly what you said, like, you have to get to where you have to understand where the power is at.
And how it's being distributed and to whom it's being distributed. And is it not
Correct.
being distributed to you? I think that's a great quote. And that's a fabulous lead into what we're talking about here today.
I know. So if people are, you know, on power trips and they don't really have the power, that's something that's hard to distinguish, but yet really an insightful thing to have when you are navigating people and learning how to get along, how to come to consensus, how to rally people, all of the above.
And that's actually the definition of politics
Yep.
is coming to a consensus, getting a group of people to come to a consensus, which is always quite difficult. I actually looked up the definition because I wanted to make sure I understood, even though we know the word, but how is it really truly defined? And so
Yeah.
that's really important.
So right on. I agree.
All right. So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll talk about, you want me to talk about just one or both?
One. We'll do one
Okay.
each.
So, one of my biggest failures in business was around poor decision making. And I think, like, I have to look back and give myself a break a little bit because I just didn't have all the things that I needed in my tool belt to actually make a great decision at the time. But as we'll talk about later, it just reevaluating how that failure happened and like everything that came out afterwards um made me become a better decision maker. So the situation was I was given the opportunity to take over a piece of business. And, looking back, I'm not sure if I was ever interested necessarily in doing that. I was actually, in the back of my mind, I was much more interested in creating something new. But I could never confront that decision head on. It took me a really long time. And by a really long time, I mean like a year, which is way too long to be in limbo. And I just kept on looking for the cold hard evidence. Like somehow like a skywriter is going to come and say, Julia, do it. Instead of just trusting what my gut and my head was telling me. And I was literally looking everywhere for advice. Like, let's talk to you. Let's talk to you. Let's talk to you. People that knew me, people that didn't, so that the answer would become clear. And in the end, I finally, I think it was my husband who was just like, you have to just make a decision, Julia, or you're going to be so miserable about it. And in the end, I would say that I did have courage and I went with my gut. Obviously, there were things that exploded afterwards. And of course, the road was not so straight. I mean, it was rocky after that because every decision you make, especially those hard ones, have consequences, whether they're good or bad consequences. And I think for a long time, I was avoiding the bad consequences and just instead of saying, yeah, this is going to happen, but there's also going to be a lot of good things, and just make the decision. Also, in retrospect, I would say it probably just took me a year to get there. I mean, it took me a year. Other people might have taken like a month, but it took me a year. So
a lot of that is fear too, right?
Oh yeah,
tons
of fear.
And being, building enough bravery to make the move, and because the unknown is so much tougher, right? Versus the known, the devil you know versus the devil you don't, which is tough.
I mean, we've talked about it, like, or maybe we haven't. Like, I'm not that big of a risk taker.
You have talked about that.
And so, yeah, it was all of that. It was bravery. It was clarity. It was so many things packed into one situation that almost like it was decision paralysis. Maybe that's the better way to describe it. It was decision paralysis. And I think, and I mean, I'll talk about this a little later, but I think that whole situation, which played out over a very long amount of time, did make me a way better decision maker. Now I can be like, okay, this needs to happen, or this needs to not happen, much quicker, much faster, with so much more confidence. So there you go. That was my biggest failure that I still think about all the time.
But again, you call that a failure, but aren't you in a better place now than where you were?
Oh, I mean,
and was it not the best decision that you could have made?
It was the best decision I ever made in my life. It led to a breakthrough in my career, a breakthrough in my life, really a breakthrough in my confidence. It was almost like it just opened the floodgates of my creativity, my, it squashed a lot of my self-doubt. It paved the way for me to really blossom. And so for sure, that failure, and all the little things that came with it, definitely turned into a great thing. I can't regret it. No regrets.
Yeah. So not that I'm a therapist, but to a certain extent, do you really call that a failure when ultimately the path, you were supposed to be on a different path, you just didn't realize it soon enough?
Well, I mean, the failure of my decision making, that's a really good question, Kelly. Very good question. Although it turned out to be good for me, the repercussions or the consequences, some of them weren't so great. It led to broken relationships, strained relationships, probably some unanswered questions from everyone involved. And that is still icky feeling, right? Like, so because I wasn't able to clarify, to be clear about my decision and why I was making that decision, I eventually just literally pulled the plug. That's how I decided to make my decision. So my gut all along was saying, what I should do, I should not proceed and instead do my own thing, and create my own thing from scratch. And yeah, so there was a lot of failures that did happen out of that. Even though there was, the ultimate thing was good, all of those other little icky things I do have some regrets over.
I love that. Well, thank you for sharing. Congratulations.
Put it out there.
It's gone. It's gone. All right. Well, I'm
Well,
gonna.
give me one, Kelly.
I will. In analyzing my failures, I'm gonna put them in a couple of categories: quitting a job and being laid off from a job. And I've done this in both cases. And in advertising, kind of like in Silicon Valley, failures is considered a badge of honor, right? Everyone in the advertising has been laid off at least once, if not many times in their careers. And being laid off happens for many reasons. It can be because you lost a piece of business. It can be because of revenues. It becomes a people person. It doesn't mean you're being fired. But of course, you tend to blame yourself when you're laid off, right? And so I want to talk about my first failure, which the lesson, I'm going to give you the lesson up front and then talk about it, which is, and we've talked about this in past episodes, never quit a job without a new one.
Yes.
And if you want out, you need to buy time to look for your next job by being brave enough to try to work things out with your boss and address their concerns. And so I'm going to give you the scenario of this particular situation. I was young. I had a female boss who was an incredibly smart woman, but also a micromanager. She not only told me what to do, she told me how to do it and who to do it with. I mean, literally to that level of detail. I was in a little teeny box, but I had this big title. And she continually not only berated me, but my team. And she really had unrealistic expectations about getting things done. And frankly, I was afraid of her. And I was too afraid to stand up to her. And the reason that I was afraid of her, part of the reason was she was one of very few women in a sea of men in the company. And she clearly had the support of her boss and senior management from my perspective. And so I felt that I could not push back on her. So instead of pushing back and trying to change my situation, I quit because I felt that it was an untenable situation for me to move into. Ultimately ended up being a good thing because within a couple months I got pregnant and had our first child, and I needed a more flexible working arrangement. So it worked out for me. But the point of all that is I shouldn't have quit. Not having a job makes it harder to find a job. And that's just the simple truth. And I really should have been braver in standing up to her and figuring out how to work through our issues, to try and see things from her point of view, even though I might not have agreed with it, at least until I could find a better opportunity elsewhere. And I think, everyone gets fed up in their career, but quitting can make everything harder. And so that was my first lesson in terms of we're all going to have people problems. You quit a boss, you don't quit a company. And so how do you work out things with your boss such that you can continue to come into work every day? Because you don't want to be dreading coming into work every day. And there's got to be a way that you can verbalize what your issues are. And I think times have changed. Corporations are more open to hearing feedback than they were 20, 30 years ago. Probably. So, I think, and the dynamics are very different. There are more women in senior management. And so I think one of the things that you and I talked about was, the generation ahead of us of women who were baby boomers. We're a generation, you're a millennial. Oh my God, I keep forgetting.
The oldest millennial.
I am a Generation Z. No, Generation X. But the women above me competed against other men. And
Yeah.
so they didn't really understand or were not told to help a lady up, right?
Heck no.
Our generation was, as was your generation and the generations underneath us. And I think because the other generation above me did not had to claw for everything that they got, they saw other women as competitions because there were so few that were already up there in that rarefied air. And I understand that point of view, and so I want to make sure that I'm pulling. That's what this podcast is all about. We want to pull other women up to learn from our mistakes to
Yes.
make their path easier. But my mistake was not standing up and being braver in the situation and not just giving up.
Yeah.
I
So
should
your
have.
failure was your disappointment in yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I almost recently quit a piece of work that I got because it was just so miserable to start. And then I was like, nope, I don't quit. I am going to power through figuring out this like bowl of spaghetti.
Lots of point of views on that one. All right, are we ready for number 2 from you?
Number 2. Okay. This is also a people thing. So like I call it misalignment. So really what happened was I got a pretty sizable contract, and it allowed me to grow and expand my team, and I was super pumped. And I really saw it as, and this we talk about in another episode, is the worst business advice: growth equals success. I
Mm.
thought, well, as I'm building my agency, I have to prove it to everybody. Like everyone needs to see that I am doing this and I am successful. Um, and to be successful, I need these big contracts and I need to have all sorts of people working under me, and that will be success. Then people will label me as success. Um, and so I was kind of blinded by that, and really didn't put the right resources behind the contract. Um, I couldn't figure out really how to make the client to fulfill what I thought they were looking for. Um, and it ended up not being the right fit at
Mm.
all. And, you know, was it all me? No. I don't think the scope that I thought out, the scope of the contract was, what I thought out, what I thought the client said, and I had a vision for it. But I think ultimately the client actually had a different vision. And whatever they read that I had scoped out, they read it with a totally different, filter. And
Hmm.
we just weren't aligned from the start. I was trying to get to, you know, Main Street, and they were trying to get to, Fifth Avenue. Uh, and eventually the contract ended prematurely, and it made me feel like a really big failure. That's actually like, that's me being really vulnerable. Like, I know I'm not saying specifically when and how and who this happened, but it made me feel it still kind of makes me feel like a big failure, because I couldn't see the forest through the trees there. It was like, no, growth equals success. Growth equals success. Um, and, I think the positives now is that, I know how I want to run my business now. And it's not necessarily with growth equals success. Every time I lead with that, it seems like maybe perhaps I'm being too greedy, instead of really looking at if it's the right fit. Like, how do I want to grow my business authentically? So again, I mean, it turned out to be a really good thing, um, for me to learn from, for sure. I felt icky about it at the time, probably still kind of do, but, yeah, it really ended up being a great learning lesson now, rather than with maybe even a bigger opportunity down the line that I could have repeated. repeated the same mistakes.
How could you have, uh, in essence, stopped or kind of stopped yourself, or would you have, would asking more questions up front? How would you have rectified this sooner in the relationship if you had it to do over again?
Well, I think one of them, and maybe, I don't know if it's an advertising thing, but um, making clients be way more involved with the scope of work and
Yeah.
setting out their vision, right? So a lot of the times clients come to me and they feel like, oh, Julia she's listening to me. She has heard everything I'm saying and she will put it down on paper, which I do, but I do it with my own angle, with my own background of experience. I interpret it the way that I am perceiving it, right? And so clients sometimes just trust, which is great, right? That's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to earn their trust so that we can have a great relationship, a great working relationship. But I think not what I could have done better is made sure that we went through it really closely. We talked through how each thing would work. To make sure that everyone's aligned. I mean, for sure, in my past, I've had clients who are like, wait a minute, let's go back to that scope. I didn't really quite understand it. Or there's always going to be some misalignment there, right? But being better at that I will surely avoid the same mistake in the future.
I think I'd like to have an episode just talking about scope of work because I have the same problem, having been in RFP land all this week, and will continue for the next couple of weeks because no one did anything in 2020, and now all of a sudden they want to do everything. And that is the biggest challenge. Is I feel like a lot of clients are coming to us and saying, "You're the experts. Tell us what we should do."
Yeah.
But their budgets may not align with what they really should be doing. And so then once they get the proposal, they're like, whoa, that's way too much.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that'd be worth chatting about in another podcast.
Yeah. It's a tough thing. I mean, scoping is something that you really get better at with experience. I think, when I was younger, I definitely would not have been able to do it. But, for me, once a scope is in a contract, I have to deliver.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about my second failure. And I took a job many, many years ago that despite reservations about company culture, its high churn rate and its leadership. And I'm going to talk about this. I had some red flags early on in the interview process. I was actually interviewed by a room full of 10 people who were all supposed to report to me. And during the course of the interview, there were hardly any questions asked at me, which is really, really rare. And so I got the job offer. I accepted it. But a week before I took the job, the CEO called me to say that the entire team that I had met had quit. And that I'd have to, yes, and that I'd have to rebuild the entire team. And there was a rationale behind it. There was some politics and issues between different divisions in the company, and literally like 15 people quit before I started. And so he said, the opportunity is you get to build your entire team. And so I said, okay. And I proceeded, and I was slowly able to hire some new people. But I was never able to hire even close to the same amount of people that were running the business in my department prior to. I think I had a third of the people that were running things before me. And these were very big pieces of business and complicated pieces of business. And there was never enough people to handle the workload. The client suffered. And it was a very difficult, challenging position to be in. And it turned out that the CEO really thrived on competition. We talked about this, and this kind of culture of fear. And he would talk about people behind their backs, and he would, in essence, backstab people. And he would, as revenues would go up and down, if they were down in a particular quarter, he would ask to eliminate people, and he would call us in, the senior management team, and say, okay, who do we get rid of next?
It's
And
like
so
the guillotine.
yeah. So, of course, your name's going to come up eventually. So
Yeah.
any miss on revenues had to be someone's fault, and no one was safe. And he would really pit us against each other. But this time I had learned my lessons of the past, and I was very verbal. I did communicate my concerns to the CEO. I did communicate my concerns about the culture, about the people, about the turnover, about my how much staff I had and how much staff I needed to do the work, and how important the role of our department was in terms of building relationship within the agency. He did not approve the addition of other people. So the strangest thing happened, and it's hard to even recount it now. He replaced me while I was still at the agency.
Oh.
One day, a new guy started and didn't know he was coming. And he had an office next to mine. And he kept coming into my office asking me all sorts of questions about my accounts. And I didn't understand why. And finally, he came in and shut the door, and he said, look, I was hired to replace you. I didn't know you were going to be here when I got here. And all of your accounts are in my contract. And I was like, okay. And he told me to expect to be let go, which I was shortly thereafter. And as my replacement, he didn't last very long in that situation either. And there's a lot of lessons learned from this. And I'm going to start with one we've talked about many times in the past, which is never work with a-holes. As my dad says, it's a funny quote. He says, and I won't, use the swear word. He said, if someone's an a-hole on Monday, they're going to be an a-hole on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Just don't work with a-holes. Bottom line. Not only are they bad news, they create an environment where other a-holes are also acceptable. And this was the scenario there. Yeah. But the bigger, more important thing was integrity and culture are extremely important. And if you're not aligned with that particular work culture, you're not going to fit in. Yeah. And a company that has a high turnover rate, which you can find out really from looking at Glassdoor and other types of third-party sites, is a serious red flag. And I failed to see the warning signs while interviewing. I mean, clearly I should have asked a lot more questions when I found out that all the people that were going to report to me were gone. Yeah. But I'm never going to, again, work with a leader who doesn't respect their employees. So that one was one that was really a big challenge for me to get over. Being replaced by a man. Honestly, who had less qualifications than I did in the arena, before being told that I was being let go. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So that was a challenge, and one of my biggest failures, because I was unable to see what was right in front of me, or I saw it and I didn't acknowledge it in the way that I should have. I should have left way before, or perhaps not even accepted the job in the first place. So those are my two failures, and I think we've got a lot of themes to talk about. Do you want to give me your themes, and I can talk about mine as well?
Whew, okay. So, well, themes of the failure or themes of the upside?
Really, I think it's taking the failure and turning it into the upside. Yes.
Yeah. There's so many, and I feel like we've talked about some of these on other podcast episodes. Yeah. I think one of them for me, related to my first failure, is that I truly had a clear appreciation for mentorship. And I realized that I had a lot of mentors around me and I hadn't necessarily acknowledged them. I hadn't thanked them. I hadn't really maybe tapped their full potential. And so that was a huge learning for me that came out of that first failure is I was so kind of maybe selfishly in my own head trying to trying so hard not to make a decision that there were a lot of people around me that were rooting for me to um make the decision, that I ultimately did. And they saw the vision way before I could acknowledge it. And so since then, I have really put in a lot more effort to ask for mentorship, ask for advice. Like I said a couple weeks ago, when I reached out to someone to help me get through kind of a roadblock, like that is such an important tool to getting through your failure is mentorship.
Absolutely.
And going along with that is that I also finally understood the value of my network. So maybe if they weren't necessarily mentors, but just the value that other people bring to your journey, like I'm kind of sometimes can be like a lone wolf and I like to be on my own. And I need to also acknowledge that the people around me are willing to help and they really bring a lot of value. I mean, once I'd made my decision, I also talk about this on an episode. I had no plan B at that time because I was so against making a decision. I had no plan B. So when I went with my gut and said, nope, this is not the right decision, I am not going to pursue this, it led to me having to end my employment because it was the dead end that I got to. Which maybe maybe if I had made a decision earlier, it wouldn't have been a dead end. But obviously I'm happy with the decision. But so yeah, that was huge. Like once I got there, then I was like, oh great, I have no plan B. And so then I started reaching out to this network and these people stepped up to the plate for me. And I'll always be grateful. So those were like two really great things that came out of that and things literally that I think about every day. I will never take advantage of those again. Or no, I will never take them for granted again.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the advice from the failures, I kind of recap: don't quit a job before you have a new one. We keep saying that over and over again. Stand up for yourself. And I tell this to my staff: if they disagree with something, let me know. I might push back and say no way, but I'm never going to say it's my way or the highway. I want it. You need to stand up for yourself always. And I listened to this podcast the other day with a business coach named Scott Anderson, and he was on the podcast talking about, the theme was being 10% braver. And he argues that failure stems from not being 10% braver. And if I had been 10% braver, I would have taken another action. And I like that because I think that's a great way to think about the actions that you're taking in your life, because you can turn them if you really just push yourself a little bit more to be braver. Another one that you and I know have in common is that we don't suffer fools lightly. And so communication is extremely important. And if I look at the commonality of some of the bosses that I've had issues with, they were really, really poor communicators. And they ended up using me as their mouthpiece because they couldn't communicate well without acknowledging it necessarily, but pushed me to do so. And communication is so important in what we do. We're in marketing. It's a communication business. And if you have a manager who's a lousy communicator, then they're in the wrong line of work, and you have a red flag. So you need to ask
Agreed.
yourself, and this is important, do you admire your boss? Are they someone you want to emulate or learn from? Are they someone that you're going to have to adapt to and work for, or someone who's going to make your life worse? And if so, then you're in the wrong place. And
Yes.
so buy yourself some time and find a new job and get out. You should admire your boss, right? I mean,
Yes.
otherwise, what's the point? We need to
You're going to
learn
spend
from
more
people.
time. Yeah. You're going to spend more time with that boss than maybe your family.
Yes, yes. And again, you're not going to agree with everything on your boss. And of course, there's going to be things that irritate you. I'm quite sure there's things about me that irritate my team. But I would hope that at least there's some basic respect and admiration for some of the things that I do and the hustle that I have.
Yeah.
And lastly, it's not always your fault. So you and I can look at these things, and there's so many different factors that it's not always our fault. Sometimes failure is the boss or the
100%.
culture or the failure of a superior to listen to feedback that could make things better, or a job that's made impossible for a number of reasons. And so we need to learn to recognize when we could have done better, and then get over it. And because maybe at that time, in that situation, where we were in our lives, there's really nothing that we could have done to make it work. And I think the main thing that you and I need to acknowledge is that every failure that I've ever had, and I believe that you would agree with this, I've always landed in a better place than where I was before. Always.
100%.
And I'm grateful for the failures, because whether I knew it or not, it was right to end things when they did and move on to the next chapter.
100%. It's the no regrets.
I agree with that. I absolutely agree. Yes, you could have done things better, but you can't regret them. You have to
Yeah,
move
I
on.
mean,
The mistakes made you who you are.
you touch on another good point too. Like within that failure, you could never walk away and say that was 100% my failure, right? Because you played a role, and everybody or thing or entity played a role as well. And that's a theme through my biggest failures too, is like, I'm willing to take responsibility and accountability for the role I played in those failures, right? But I do give myself the grace to know that it wasn't all me. Um of course, when we take it on, it can lead to some scars. It can lead to some things that, I know other people that have, when I've talked to them about their failures, it's something that holds them back for a really long time because it is a deep wound that's hard to get over. But part of getting over it is and really acknowledging the failure and trying to figure out the good stuff that comes out is it is not necessarily all on you. And that's the part that helps you let go. Huge learning. As someone who's very self-critical, it's very hard for me to get to that place. So I just have to keep telling myself, like, it's not all you.
Before we get to the part where we release the doves, and burn the and burn things. I got the doves hiding back over here. I'd like you to acknowledge that, you're 10 years younger than me, and you are in such an amazing place for your age. I wasn't where you were at your age. You have how many kids under 10? 3?
3.
Under 10, right?
Yep, 10 and under.
3 kids 10 and under. Mine are teenagers. I'm in a very different space in terms of my job responsibilities as a mom. So you're running your own business with 3 kids under 10. So you need to
It's really kind of insane.
You need to give yourself a break, because not only are you a mom with young children, much younger than I am, but you have a side hustle of a podcast. You have, you wrote your own book. You started your own business when you were pregnant with your third child. So from my perspective, from the outside, you got it all. So I'd like you to acknowledge that you're in such a better place than where I was 10 years ago. And so, I think the self-criticalness of each of us is where we need to watch it and appreciate, because from the outside, people don't know what you struggle with, right?
Oh, of course. But yeah, I'll invite you over, Kelly. You can see my daily fails with being a mom and doing work. It's not easy.
Yeah, well, I'm there as well, especially when you have teenagers who criticize you on a regular basis. My son, his new saying about me is, "You are so extra."
No.
Meaning, like, I do too much. Like, yeah, you're so extra, mom. So that's an insult, apparently, but that's.
Well, I think. Well, thank you for the compliment, first of all. You're right. Like, I think part of the reason why you and I both kind of aligned on this podcast was that talking about these things and acknowledging them and putting them out there, really, we're not doing things that are just so unique. There are so many other moms and women that have probably been through some of these very same experiences, and like, you're not alone. You just said it, like, as an outsider, your perspective is so much more different of my successes and failures, and vice versa, right? Like, our own inner critic is usually the worst.
Yeah.
But I really do I really love this episode, and I'm so glad we did it, because I'm all about, like, let's evaluate. Let's point them out, and let's say, you, failure, didn't like you, but what came out that was great. And I agree. If I could rewind the clock and not make those mistakes again, I mean, maybe I would have done some things like a little bit different, but the outcomes, thank goodness they happened.
No regrets. So now I think it's time that we release the doves. Raise your hands, Julia. Release the doves.
We're releasing the doves.
They're gone. Gone.
Release your failures. But only after you've done the analysis and you can say, hey, I learned some things. And
only took us 6 months to figure this out. Well, thanks, Julia. Great episode, and I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a podcast review or send us a message at twomarketingmoms.com. And subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.